Hello everybody, today we're going to show you how to service a standard hub, and by that I mean cup and cone bearings. Now, a lot of new modern hubs, they use sealed cartridge bearings, but something which I've learned today is that all Shimano models right up to the very top still use the traditional bearings. Now we're going to show you using a rear wheel here, and of course to get to the bearings you're going to have to remove this cassette. For that you're going to need the cassette removal tools, and of course here at GCN we've already got a video which shows you exactly how to do that. Once you've got the cassette off, the other tools that you're going to need are a couple of cone spanners. Now they're different sizes for different wheels, but in this case we've got a 13 and a 17mm one. You're also going to need some degreaser, something like this, to clean up the ball bearings, the inside of the hub and the cones, etc. Some grease when you come to put it all back together again. A small tool like this which will help you to get the ball bearings out in the first place. Some kind of tray, anything will do really, just to make sure that the ball bearings stay in the right place and you don't drop them and lose them on the floor. And finally, if you want to be particularly luxurious, we've got this, which is a magnet which helps to get the ball bearings out if they get stuck down the middle of the hub. It's a good idea to do this at least a couple of times a year if you ride a lot. If you start to feel that the axle doesn't turn in the hub smoothly, then it definitely needs a service. The same applies if there is some play in the hub. You can check this by moving the rim from side to side in the frame or forks. Start by removing the quick release and then the cassette. Now you're ready to undo the cones. On a rear hub, it's important to remember to only undo the non-drive side cones on the opposite side to the cassette. Slide the cone spanner onto the cone itself and then put the other one on the locknut. Hold the cone in place and unscrew the locknut anti-clockwise. It shouldn't be long before you can undo the nut by hand. Remove it completely along with any spacers, making sure to keep them in the right order when you set them aside so that you know which way they go back on. Next, making sure that the drive side is resting on your tin, unscrew the cone on the non-drive side by hand. Once the cone is out, you will probably be able to see the bearings. On some hubs you will be able to prise the seal away to allow easier access to the bearings, but on our Shimano 105 hub we're going to leave it in as you risk deforming the seal if you pull it out with a screwdriver, which will mean it's more susceptible to water getting in later. Pull the axle through the drive side to allow yourself access to the non-drive side bearings. This is where our magnet tool really comes in handy. If you've got one, simply place it inside the hub and all of the bearings should stick to it. If not, you'll have to do it gently by hand or using some kind of tool to get the bearings out. Place the bearings on one side of your tray, next to the cone and lock nut from the same side. It's important to remember which bearings came from which side of the hub, as they wear at slightly different rates and will have bedded themselves in. Next, keeping the axle in place with one hand, turn the wheel over and repeat these steps for the drive side. Again, putting the bearings together on one side of your tray so that you know which side is which. Now it's time to clean and inspect the bearings, cones and cups within the hub. We tend to use a strong degreaser on the bearings and axle cones, but not inside a rear hub in case it gets into the freewheel. Instead, just using some paper towel to make sure there's no grit left inside. If you do this job regularly, it's likely that all the surfaces will be smooth. However, if it's been neglected, there may be some grooves or wear evident. If this is the case, then it might be time to replace the hub, as spares are hard to come by in this day and age. With all that done, it's time to start putting it all back together. We need to start by packing grease into the drive side cup. This is much easier using a grease gun, especially if, like us, you've left the seal in. But if you don't have one, use your little finger to pack the grease in. Next, start placing the bearings into the grease. It can be easy to loosen down the centre of the hub if you're not careful. To stop this, you can briefly insert the axle the wrong way into the hub so that the bearings don't have anywhere to go. Once all the bearings are in, put a little more grease over the top of them and then gently remove the axle and put it back through in the correct way. Repeat these steps on the non-drive side, at which point you'll be ready to thread the cone back onto the axle. However, don't tighten it up too much. It's at this point where you need to start tightening the cone up so that there's no movement on the axle from side to side, but not too tight that there's any friction as you turn it. Bear in mind that we've got new grease in here and that's going to take a little while to pack in, so it's worth checking this after the first couple of rides to make sure there's still no play after that grease has bedded in. Once the cones are properly adjusted, it's time to put the spacers and lock nut back on, remembering which order they came off. To tighten the lock nut, it's important to make sure that the cone is held by the spanner and that you only move the lock nut clockwise to tighten it. Otherwise you will adjust the tightness of the axle itself. Just to re-emphasise, it's very important to check if there is any play in the hub after your first ride, and if there is, simply undo the non-drive side lock nut and adjust the cone accordingly. Next, it's time to stretch the tub onto the rim. This can be quite a finicky process, and an extra pair of hands at this point can come in, well, handy.